How about it, folks? Today I am taking you on a walkthrough of the walkthrough that is In Violent Nature. I've been excited about this one for a while without really knowing anything about it. I knew where it was filmed and I knew it was a novel take on slasher movies. Yeah, I get excited over nothing sometimes. I'm gonna break the movie down into 3 acts and give you my interpretation of what I thought writer-director Chris Nash was trying to convey with this film. And just a quick heads up, I had to get kind of creative with some of my language and presentation in hopes that I could maybe slip a few things past YouTube's censors. The movie opens to the calming sounds of the great outdoors, and we can hear Colt, Aaron, and Troy speaking to each other clearly off camera, while we are slowly panning through the interior of what we learn later to be a dilapidated fire tower. They mention a gold pendant hanging from a tree branch sticking out of the ground, and then one of them references the White Pine Slaughter without elaborating on the event. They decide to leave, given the place is giving them all the creeps. Not to mention they're hoping to meet up with a few girls they just met in the gas station. And it doesn't really get more slasher movie than that. And as they're all leaving, Troy lifts the pendant off the branch. And that brings the first act to a close by kicking off an underground gurgling sound, which portends the arrival of this movie's central focus and our point of view character, Johnny. That was the briefest opening act I've ever reviewed, and probably the most effective in terms of setting the tone and establishing the central conflict. We don't see any characters, we don't get any backstory, but we do see the horror movie sin being committed when one of the characters decides to steal the locket. And in horror movie terms, that's all we need to see. Whatever's coming next, these guys deserve it. To start the second act, we fall behind Johnny like an over-the-shoulder view of a first-person video game character, and he's trudging forward without speaking. Some persistent car honking and shouting off in the distance draws Johnny's attention, so he starts walking towards it. Just like the opening scene, we can hear men clearly speaking despite neither of them being in the shot. And we follow Johnny as he's honing in on the argument. A forest ranger is berating somebody about animal traps he's left all over the forest. He's warning him how dangerous they are. By the time Johnny reaches the house, the ranger's already driving off and the other man's just gone inside. So Johnny follows him. Inside the rundown house, a gold pendant hanging in the room triggers some exposition in the form of a flashback, as Johnny recalls his father giving him his deceased mother's gold pendant as a reminder of her and his dad. And clearly, this is not the pendant Troy lifted in the opening scene to trigger Johnny's resurrection, but the homeowner comes in before Johnny can inspect it. This first pursuit of the film ends abruptly when the man's caught in the irony of one of the very traps the ranger just told him to remove. And after he's been deleted, off camera mind you, Johnny goes back in and verifies the pendant is not the one he's looking for. So he gets to searching again. He starts in daylight. By the time he comes across the gang from the opening scene, it's dark outside. They use a series of jump cuts to convey the passing of the hours. Johnny's pace and cadence remains steady the entire time, and given how much walking there is in this movie, a lot of people claim these scenes have an unexpected calming effect. And I can confirm I felt exactly that during each of my viewings. In typical slasher fashion, the group of young folks are gathered around a campfire. The conversation ends up back on the White Pine Slaughter mentioned in the opening scene. Not surprisingly, Aaron's word-of-mouth recollection provides us with a possible version of Johnny's backstory, much the way you'd see at the start of a Friday the 13th movie. And that story, in a nutshell, 70 years ago, that area they're in, White Pine, was managed by a logging company. Because the location was so remote, they set up a bunch of stores where the loggers could buy soap and toiletries and such. And the guy in charge of running all the stores overcharged everybody, and he was hated for it. And the guy who ran the stores had a son named Johnny, who was a mentally challenged young fella. One day, one of the loggers purportedly tripped over one of Johnny's toys. That put the logger out of work for months with a broken ankle. And to get back at him for it, they decided to play a prank on Johnny. So they told him there was loads of toys and a bag up at the top of the fire tower. So he snuck up there later that night, only to find the man dressed up in an old firefighter's mask, hoping to scare him. And he did scare him. And Johnny fell to the ground and died. So the men panicked. They put the old fire mask on Johnny to imply he was up there playing around by himself and fell off. But Johnny's father didn't believe them, and when he went to confront the loggers, a fight broke out, and Johnny's father ended up expiring too. The following week, when a bunch of company executives visited, every single one of the loggers was dead and torn to pieces. And one of the police officers claimed they saw somebody wearing a mask watching them from the forest. And if this story sounds overblown and complicated and ridiculous, it's meant to, as the writer-director Chris Nash is bombarding you with slasher tropes, ironically. And while the story is being told, you can see Johnny is nearby, as he usually is when he's not the point of view character. The gang disperses and we go back into Johnny's point of view. And as he's walking, we eavesdrop on the same kind of meaningless conversations you usually hear in slasher movies. Throughout this film, if you're paying attention, you will notice the dialogue's choppy and the acting is high school drama class at best. That's also part of Nash's plan. Then Johnny happens upon Aaron as he's looking for somewhere to evacuate his bowels in the woods. And we get to see the first of this movie's practical effects. When over the sound of crunching cartilage and breaking bones, Aaron's maxilla is separated from his mandible. Johnny takes both halves of Aaron's bisected body to the ranger station, and he opens the glass door with Aaron's cheerful face. Then he gains access to the weapons he needs with Aaron's lifeless body. A moment later, Johnny's all kitted out for the party, and this party is starting with the girls. He sets his tree-cutting utensil down and walks across the floor of the lake bed. And when one of the girls named Aurora leaves to do yoga elsewhere, Johnny snags the remaining girl from below. And initially, Nash wanted the cameras following Johnny under the water, but it proved impractical. Much like the original Jaws film, that proved advantageous to the movie in the long run. Sometimes less is better. The implication Johnny is under the water somewhere during this near-silent long shot makes this scene surprisingly tense and very well orchestrated in terms of realism. And on the other end of the realism spectrum, he then corners Aurora, the other girl, for what's now known all over the internet as the yoga kill. He drives his fireman's hook through her abdominal wall with astounding vigor. Then he anchors the hook into the anterior aspect of her cranium before spinning her around to face away from him so he can retract the hook with the cranium still attached, of course, back through the vacant midsection, thus turning her into a human bowline knot. Then he flings her off the cliff and retrieves his tree-cutting utensil and heads off in search of the pendant again. And he happens upon the three remaining campers, and although we don't see them yet either, we can hear them arguing about going to the police about their missing friends. One of them fires their keys into the woods to stop the other one from leaving, and they land at Johnny's feet. Having the mind of a child and a healthy love of toys, Johnny sits down and plays with the toy car on the keychain, and we get to see what he looks like, really close up, and I think those prosthetics are flawless. Sorry. Back to business. Next up, Johnny wedges a branch against the car horn to draw out whoever's inside, and it works. He gets his sharpened tree-cutting utensil pretty deep into Troy's vastus lateralis. Unfortunately for Troy, Evan has a rifle, and that puts Johnny down long enough for them to start getting away. But Johnny has Olympic-level aim and thrust, so his tree-cutting utensil finds the back of Evan's skull with the same vigor used on Aurora, the yoga girl. And that leaves poor Troy helpless on the ground waiting for Johnny to demonstrate how hard he rocks. And I've watched this scene dozens of times already. Johnny checks everyone's pockets for the pendant to no avail, but then he sees it hanging from Chris's neck. That means Troy must have given it to her.
Ew.
Johnny fires his tree-cutting utensil right at them in another subtle but effective special effect. But Colt and Chris get away on an ATV, and they head straight to the ranger's station, as does our main man, Johnny. As he's approaching the station, the ranger's shouting at Chris and Colt for stealing the pendant in the first place. When the ranger sees Johnny, he tells him he remembers him from 10 years ago, and he shoots him. We know that incapacitates Johnny, but not for how long. While he's down, the ranger tells Chris the stories about Johnny are partially true, and his father actually survived the attacks. But 10 years ago, Johnny rose again and killed his father and the rest of his family, so now it's the ranger's duty to put Johnny back in the ground at the fire tower, where he belongs. But that doesn't happen, because Johnny breaks the ranger's back instead. And what follows is space spectacular in slasher terms as far as I'm concerned. Paralyzed from the crushed spinal column, Johnny throws a hook into the ranger's thoracic cavity and leads him into the woodshed, where he slowly separates the ranger from his appendages and his noggin, all while the ranger is fully aware of what's happening but unable to do anything about it. And again, keep your eyes on the ranger's eyes, which are still moving as the separation begins. The effect is beautiful in its realism and absolute lack of CGI bullshit. With only Colt and Chris left, the pair decide to try and trap Johnny and lead him back to the fire tower, but once again, their plans go to shit as soon as they try executing them. Colt's cranium is bisected against a tree, then it's pulverized into the ground for several actual minutes, while Chris watches on from a distance with a gas can and a bear trap in her hands. She ends the second act by setting them both down and leaving the pendant dangling for Johnny to find. She backs out of the forest, slow and steady, all while Johnny is still smashing Colt into crimson porridge on the forest floor.
The opening act set us up for a traditional slasher story, and in a lot of ways, this is a traditional slasher story. We've got a psychopathic supernatural killer wearing a mask. That killer has armed himself with his weapons of choice in the antiquated firefighter gear he took from the ranger station. Whether it's accurate or not, they have revealed the killer's backstory. It's set in the woods, there's a cabin, and there is multiple victims. And the killer has even resurrected themselves already. All of this was intentional on Chris Nash's part. He used all these familiar elements so he wouldn't have to explain any of them. And that lets him totally sidestep a lot of the annoying over-explaining you get in a lot of slasher movies. Now, the rest of the characters are completely underdeveloped, but that's also intentional. Nobody actually cares about the characters in a slasher movie, beyond maybe the final girl. But obviously, what's not traditional about this second act is the point of view. Binding us to Johnny the Killer gives us more than just a fresh new camera angle. His slow, relentless, constant forward movement always results in him finding somebody and killing them. And he is always either moving forward or killing somebody. And yes, the mystery of the killer from a more traditional cat and mouse style slasher movie is gone. But in its place, Nash has instilled a sense of inevitability in us without us really realizing he's done it. We'll talk more about that later on. Now, our final trope in this movie is the final girl, Chris. Let's find out what happens to her.
Fuck this shit.
After an overnight trek through dense, dark forest, over a soundtrack of crickets and things snapping under her feet, Chris impales her ankle on a decent-sized stick, but she finds the road a few minutes later. This marks the start of the section in the movie people are complaining about. And again, in hyper-typical slasher fashion, she's rescued by a stranger passing by in a pickup truck. Not coincidentally, the driver's played by Scream Queen extraordinaire Lauren Marie Taylor, who you might recognize from Friday the 13th Part 2, but you also might not. What happens in this final scene is probably easiest to process if you imagine we're picking up right where Texas Chainsaw Massacre left off, with Sally Hardesty climbing into somebody's truck. After seeing Chris's leg and the overall state of her, the woman agrees to drive Chris to the hospital. When she asks what happened, Chris lies and says she fell, probably to avoid taking any responsibility for her involvement with the pendant. But the woman presses for the truth, so Chris says it was an animal. That prompts the woman to encourage Chris she's going to be okay, and she tells her a story to help convey her sincerity. The woman tells Chris about her brother. When he used to be a game warden, a bear nearly mauled him to death. He was investigating the bear because it had killed all sorts of animals in the area without eating any of them, and that's unusual. Right when he thought the bear had moved on, it bit into the back of his head. Apparently her brother's able to laugh about it now, but he's doing so as a coping mechanism. Her brother survived because a colleague pulled him out of the water and did CPR. The obvious correlation between the bear and Johnny prompts Chris to ask what happened to the bear. But they never found the bear. The only explanation they could come up with was animals don't get hung up on reason as much as people tend to. A lot of people say the woman's story goes on too long, or that it's boring, or that Nash made a mistake shifting to Chris's perspective in the dying minutes of this movie. But I think it's possible to get a lot more out out of this movie if you shift your perspective.
Remember when I said Nash instilled a sense of inevitability in us by switching up the point of view character?
Pay attention to the distinct sensation you experience the whole time Chris is in this woman's car. That same sensation heightens dramatically when the woman pulls over to tend to Chris's bleeding leg. Once she opens the door, you'll feel it more, and even more again as Chris looks out into the forest in an otherwise silent landscape. We're waiting for Johnny to pop up and pull them apart. They've driven for miles, but that doesn't stop us believing it's going to happen any second. After all, we've been with him the whole time, watching his relentless pursuits as if we were walking alongside him. This is what he does. And aren't horror movies supposed to end in a bang? When the credits roll and you realize he didn't come, Chris Shaw has just caused you to experience the sensation of trauma from the safety of your own couch. It's a tangible, palpable sensation you felt all around you as you watched Chris and that woman talking in the car. He's honed in on it, and he's cast it upon us in the audience, and he didn't even need a single cheap jump scare or a shrieking orchestra to accomplish it.
This movie tried something bold, and I ended up enjoying it way more than I thought I was going to, just based on the premise. But it might have failed to tie everything together properly in the end. On the one hand,
in terms of tone and atmosphere, this would have been my top movie for 2024 if it weren't for The Coffee Table by Kaya Casas. But I mean, come on, it's gonna be years before we see a film with that much tension in it again. Nash's decision to present Johnny as a force of nature with no sound effects or startling violin bursts had an unexpected effect on me, and in plain terms, I loved it.
Also, if I haven't made my feelings clear on the subject already, fuck yes to the practical effects.
Chris Nash's background is in practical effects, and it's obvious it's his passion. This movie brought me back to being 12 years old and nagging the owner of my local funeral home for mortician's wax so I could decorate all my friends' faces at Halloween like Rick Baker. The effects were thought out and well executed, and yeah, at times they were over the top, but that's the way to do it. Artists are supposed to try new things and go too far. That is how you break new ground.
When it comes to movies, I decide who gets my hard-earned money. If it comes down to a choice between this and this, you can call me a yoga fan every time. When it comes to you, that's why they invented torrents. However, for everything I thought this movie got right, I can't ignore the fact so many people felt let down by the ending, even if I enjoyed it. I didn't start this channel so I could tell as many people as possible what I thought about these movies. It's supposed to be a back and forth.
After my first viewing, I thought Chris Nash not only gave the middle finger to horror movie convention with Act 3, I also thought he'd accomplished something remarkable. When I looked into Chris's eyes and she looked back into mine, it dawned on me this directorial debut from a Canadian fella I knew very little about made me feel trauma. Not in some vague, creepy, there's something off here kind of way, but real existential, long-lasting, post-traumatic stress.
That's why the final speech had to drag on a bit. That's why they had to be driving for a few miles before they pulled the car over. We needed to be a safe distance away from the danger. If you cut that final scene in half, it couldn't have had the same effect.
If you've watched this movie, you'll never convince me you weren't as positive as I was that that woman or Chris wasn't about to get it in the back of the head.
We worried about something beyond reason. We didn't care they were miles away. We didn't care they could see everything around them. We just didn't care. We were safe, but we didn't feel safe. And that little inexplicable sensation we all felt during that scene is trauma.
This final act absolutely worked on me, but if it didn't work on half the audience, there must be a reason. After reading hundreds of negative reviews, the consensus seems to be, despite featuring so many traditional slasher tropes, the point of view change and the subverted ending just aren't what people want in their slasher films.
Horror movies have tropes in order to set expectations. And when you have expectations going into the movie, it guarantees you suspense before the movie has even started.
Tropes are tropes for a reason, and we cling to them for a reason. It seems clear a lot of people felt this movie deviated too far off the familiar path.
I don't agree, but I totally understand. Now, having said that, This movie has taught me something about tropes.
I've suspected we don't need them for a long time, and in a violent nature reassures me I might be right, because it's made me question what I actually like about these movies. I thought I was a fan of characters, but this movie didn't develop any. I also thought I was a fan of the suspense of not seeing the killer coming, but I just spent 90% of this movie as Johnny's lunch buddy at school.
Maybe I just really enjoy awful, bloody violence. Whatever it is, I'll be thinking about this for a while. And for me, it's always a positive thing if a movie gets me thinking. If you have seen In a Violent Nature already, I would love to hear what you thought about it down in the comments. As always, thank you so much for watching. And until next time, folks. It's me, Johnny, from that video you just loved, and I know you loved it because this book I read told me if I constantly say that to you, you will start to believe it's true. So thanks for loving that video you just watched. You're also going to love this next video as soon as you click on it. Click on it.